Welcome to RaWMachines, a journey into some of the most remarkable working processes around the world. In this episode, we travel to the high fens to follow the peat cutting, drying, and transport practices of the villagers of Sauerbrot, an age-old tradition shaped by seasons, terrain, and a harsh climate. From the first cut in the bog to the final peat cart of the season, this is a story of technique, inherited knowledge, and collective labor. Let's begin. In late May, when spring truly draws to a close on the high fens raised bog, the call of the cuckoo signals that the risk of notched frost has passed and the peat cutting season can begin. On the edge of this moorland lies Sauerbrot, a village near Monschau and the Eifel, close to the German border and almost 700 meters above sea level, where everyday life has long been shaped by the demands of the natural environment. Before entering the bog, the tools are taken from the shed, with the Torfschippel, the peat-cutting spade, at the center of the work. Its blade is sharpened on a wet grinding stone, the steady drip of water cooling the steel and giving it the edge required for a clean cut. Depending on the structure of each peat layer, the people of Sauerbrot use different spades, from narrow blades for deep peat to wider, heavier ones for cutting the surface turf. Sizes vary, but the technical requirement remains the same. The blade must be sharp enough to release the peat in clean blocks, preserving their shape throughout drying and transport. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, while daylight is still dim and the ground cold and wet, the people of Sauerbrot leave the village for a walk of more than 2 hours into the high fens raised bog. The departure time is carefully chosen to take advantage of the still firm surface of the moor and to use the full span of daylight for a working shift that lasts until late afternoon. While the men prepare tools and means of transport, provisions for the entire day are packed, as returning once inside, the bog is not an option. The wheelbarrow, jokingly called the BMW by the Walloons, carries not only tools, but also food, water, and essential supplies for a long day's work. The heavy peat spades, fitted with curved wooden handles and a distinctive hook, allow precise control of the blade as it is driven into the peat. The work demands correct posture, steady force, and an exact cutting angle, showing that labor on the raised bog relies not on raw strength alone, but on careful preparation and skills passed down through generations. Leaving the planted forest at the edge of the village, the landscape opens into the high fens raised bog, with gently sloping ground broken by wet hollows. In late May, the surface is green and flecked with the white heads of late spring cotton grass. Beneath this cover, however, lies the unstable structure of the bog, where only a few well-known paths are firm enough for safe passage. The raised bog is fed primarily by rainfall, and therefore remains permanently waterlogged. Experienced workers know the seepage lines and small open springs where drinking water can be taken directly on site. The thick peat layers store water like a natural reservoir, while at the same time concealing the risk of slow, underground smoldering fires during prolonged dry spells. Because of the depth and instability of the raised bog, peat can only be extracted at fixed locations. In Sauerbrot, this area is known as the Crossy Terra, a narrow extraction strip running along the edge of the high fens for about 1 kilometer, with an elevation difference of nearly 4 meters. Here, the peat is exposed in a dark vertical face, stable enough to organize systematic work. Preparation of the working face is usually carried out the day before. Drainage trenches are dug, ladder positions are set, and the ground in front of the face is cleared and leveled for laying out, drying, and stacking the peat. Early the next morning, the work crew returns and begins cutting. A small fire is set up beside the site to support a long working day. Because of the risk of subterranean peat fires, however, it must be closely controlled and completely extinguished before leaving. This danger also limits the cutting season, which usually ends around July 10th, before the bog enters its dry phase. The working face is organized around a centrally placed ladder that serves as a boundary marker. From this point, slightly curved extraction plots extend backward, each about 15 meters wide and assigned to a single family. These boundaries are clearly visible on the bog through the placement of ladders, drainage trenches, and the arrangement of the drying grounds in front. Each work unit typically consists of 2 people cutting peat and 1 person handling the wheelbarrow, with additional helpers clearing trenches and keeping access paths open. Before any peat is laid out to dry, the forecourt areas must be opened collectively, showing that, although the yield belongs to individual families, the foundation of the extraction process remains communal. Peat extraction is not a matter of digging soil, but of cutting solid blocks with a high degree of precision. The decisive tool is the peat-cutting spade, with a blade nearly 30 centimeters wide. This dimension is deliberate, establishing a standard for each cut and for the entire sequence of work that follows. Peat only becomes usable when the blocks are cut uniformly, as every subsequent step depends on this consistency. The cutter begins by scoring vertical and horizontal guidelines into the exposed peat face. From these cuts, a block made up of 4 stacked sections is formed. Horizontal cuts separate the sections, allowing the block to be released from the face without tearing. The sequence is fixed, first shaping, then detaching from the face, and finally lifting out each section in order. This order cannot be reversed, as a single faulty cut is enough to break the block and render drying and stacking impossible. The accuracy of each cut determines the success of all later stages. Only flat, even blocks can be stood upright, dry quickly, and reach sufficient dryness within the short cutting season. Extraction proceeds step by step, descending through the accumulated layers of the bog. Once one level is cleared, work continues on the next lower tier, until the water level of the drainage trench is reached. At depths of around 4 meters, the spade may strike birch trunks that have lain preserved in the peat for some 10,000 years. Once dried, this wood can be used as fuel and stands as evidence of how the raised bog formed after the last ice age, as moss accumulated, died, and was compressed into peat, layer upon layer, gradually lifting the bog's surface. Not all excavated material qualifies as peat fuel. The upper layers often contain roots and loose structures and are unsuitable for burning. This material is used instead to backfill trenches or reinforce paths. Only the deeper layers, where plant matter has been fully compacted and homogenized, are cut into blocks for drying and storage. Working below the general water level is only possible through strict water management. Drainage trenches are dug parallel to the working face and must be kept clear at all times, using the slight slope of the bog margin to channel water away. If a trench becomes blocked, water quickly rises, turning the work area into a quagmire and forcing operations to stop. For this reason, each work group includes someone responsible solely for maintaining the drains. Although this task produces no peat directly, it determines the functioning of the entire operation. The drainkeeper continually removes mud, roots, and debris, ensuring uninterrupted water flow so that the working surface remains dry and stable.
Il y a des mains nègres, c'est au visage des blancs.
During the working day, peat cutters take only 2 short breaks, usually around 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. At these moments, the groups pause and gather to talk about family matters, the progress of the season, and the condition of the drainage trenches, creating a rhythm of communal life within the bog.
Tu dois faire encore ça?
Vai te de manhã.
Food is brought from home and laid out directly on the ground. White bread, butter, jam, or boiled eggs, accompanied by hot coffee, replace regular meals and serve as compensation for the physical labor. Baskets and cloth coverings help keep provisions fresh in the open air. When the day's work ends, personal belongings are carried back to the village, while the tools are often left on site. The spades are set into the soft peat to prevent rust, ready for the next working day.
Det blir man illa pass rätt och någon som betonstrycker. Ja, men det ska roda sig. Så att vi går över det. Och så vi går här på så hålla klapper.
Freshly cut peat still contains a very high water content, often up to around 75%. In this state, even a single night of light frost can freeze the blocks, causing them to crack and become unusable. For this reason, the drying process is organized carefully and begins immediately as soon as the peat leaves the cutting face. The peat is transported by wheelbarrow to the drying ground in front of the working face. Each load typically carries 6 blocks, or 24 individual pieces. At the drying site, the pieces are stood upright in rows and pressed lightly into the ground to withstand the wind. Gaps are left between them so that air can circulate from all sides, allowing the peat to dry evenly. The drying ground is relatively narrow and must be leveled with care. If the stacking is uneven, the collapse of a single row can trigger a chain reaction, wasting both labor and valuable time from the short season. For this reason, the drying rows are monitored closely throughout the drying period. Over the course of the season, the peat blocks are repeatedly turned, re-erected, and rearranged to ensure that all surfaces are exposed to air. Only once the peat has reached a stable level of dryness can it be stacked and transported further without the risk of cracking or mold. When the working face has been cut down to the lowest water level, the cutting cycle turns and begins again at the upper edge of the wall. The latter is repositioned at the boundary so that both neighboring groups can use it. The tough, compact surface turf is cut into slabs. In the past, these sods were used for roofing or reinforcement. In peat cutting, they are placed at the bottom of the trenches to fill the voids created by extraction and to stabilize the bog surface. The upper layers of material, still loose and rich in roots, are not considered usable peat fuel. Instead, they are used to backfill old trenches and restore the ground. According to traditional regulations, the extraction area must be leveled and recovered with turf to a specified thickness, and unused rights may be withdrawn and reassigned. The legal framework governing peat cutting was established in 1844. Each long-established family in Sauerbrod is permitted to cut peat for 12 days per season, 5 of which are reserved for household use. Peat extracted for sale is subject to a daily fee paid to the local authorities. At this point, cutting work at the bog is considered complete. The peat blocks have been freed from the bog, but they are not yet usable. From here on, the focus of the season shifts to a longer phase, entirely dependent on weather, drying and transport. Once cut from the bog, peat remains heavily waterlogged and cannot be used immediately. Extraction therefore truly continues through the stages of drying and transport, the decisive processes that turn peat into winter fuel for life on the high fens. From late June to early August, when heather blooms across the bog, the people of Sauerbrot return to the drying grounds at Gross Terra. Because the walk takes several hours, they carry tools and provisions for the entire working day. Even in midsummer, peat cut in spring must still be turned, stood upright, and restacked, as prolonged periods of rain can ruin an entire drying ground. In the past, almost every long-established family produced its own fuel here. The last active peat cutters were recorded in 1977, after which the exposed faces were gradually reclaimed by vegetation. To document the process for a documentary film, several residents of Sauerbrod reopened 2 working faces at Gross Terra and reconstructed the long-stepped cutting technique once practiced here for centuries. After several weeks of drying, when the peat has reached a semi-dry state, the next task is to turn and re-erect the blocks so that the underside, still damp from contact with the ground, can dry completely. This stage is known as höppern. The peat is set up in small clusters, typically 4 blocks leaning against one another, with a 5th placed on top for stability. This arrangement creates gaps that allow air to circulate, ensuring more even drying. The work requires precision in the angle of placement and often involves children from the family, introducing them to the rhythms of traditional labor. On the dried surfaces, the marks of the spade appear as regular, parallel cuts, revealing how the blocks were separated, set upright, and arranged in tiers throughout the cutting season. In the past, peat extraction was carried out on a far larger scale than today. While only a few family groups now take part in reconstructions, until the 1950s around 60 households in Sauerbrod regularly relied on peat from the Ven for heating. Throughout the cutting season, work proceeded almost continuously. Today, the restored sites dry only about 6,000 peat blocks, whereas in earlier times, each family typically stored between 10,000 and 15,000 blocks to last through the winter. peat was not only used within the village, but was also sold to nearby towns such as Eupen, St. Vith, and Monschau, forming an integral part of the local economy. In years of prolonged rainfall, drying peat became far more demanding. Only when the blocks were nearly completely dry could they be gathered and transported, ensuring a sufficient fuel supply for the long winter. Stacking the peat into man-high piles is the final stage on the drying ground, usually carried out in late autumn. Once the blocks have hardened sufficiently, they are built into tall, pyramid-shaped stacks to increase exposure to wind and to continue drying before transport. This step, known locally as M-Truth, makes use of the strong upland winds. The airflow helps the peat dry evenly and also drives away insects common to the bog environment. Because the reconstruction is limited in scale, the film can only demonstrate the stacking method, not the landscape once filled with hundreds of such towers. Even so, this stage marks the point at which the peat is ready to leave the drying ground, bringing the outdoor drying season to a close. Freshly cut peat blocks are dark in color, with a glossy, wet surface. As drying progresses, water slowly evaporates, the color shifts toward brown, and the structure becomes more fibrous and lighter. At the same time, the blocks shrink noticeably from an initial size of about 30 x 7.5 centimeters to roughly 20 centimeters in length, around 11 centimeters in width, and nearly 4 centimeters in thickness once fully stabilized. These dimensions form the standard size for stacking and storage. Once the peat has reached a sufficient degree of dryness, it is assembled into large piles for final airing. These piles, known locally as M-Truth, are tall stacks of peat built in rounded or near pyramidal forms and used for late-season drying before transport. Each M-Truth is erected on prepared ground and typically measures about 80 centimeters in diameter. The stacking technique depends on the remaining moisture in the peat. If the blocks are still damp, the core of the stack is left hollow to improve airflow. If the peat is drier, the core may be filled with peat fragments. During stacking, the thicker face of each block is always turned inward, creating a slight outward slope that allows rainwater to run off. In the upland bog climate, where autumn rain is frequent, stacking requires great care. The layers narrow toward the top like a roof, with the peak sealed using fragments and a small locking block. If the peat is not yet dry enough, the core of the M-Truth remains open, and the lower blocks are set radially to enhance ventilation. After 1 or 2 weeks, the stacks may need to be rebuilt to bring still damp blocks to higher positions. Once the peat has fully hardened, it scarcely absorbs moisture, even during prolonged rainfall, and can remain outdoors for extended periods before transport. By traditional convention, a standard M-Truth consists of about 30 layers, or roughly 500 peat blocks. In the past, large drying grounds held tens of thousands of blocks packed into such stacks, forming a characteristic landscape at the close of the working season on the raised bog. To transport peat from the cutting grounds back to the village, suitable vehicles and draft power had to be chosen for the conditions of the high fens, where the ground is soft and prone to sinking. Transport usually began after the harvest, when the roots across the bog had become more stable. Horses were used only in limited situations. On soft peat soils, their weight caused carts to sink easily, so they were confined to relatively dry stretches and never served as the primary source of traction. The main draft animals were working cattle of the upland bog region. They were harnessed with head yokes or shoulder yokes, which distributed the load more evenly. Their wide-spreading hooves provided firm footing on the soft ground, making them heavy yet remarkably stable when pulling fully loaded peat carts over long distances. Oxen were usually hitched in pairs to ensure sufficient pulling power and safety. Because of the terrain, two-wheeled carts could not be used on the bog. Four-wheeled wagons were employed instead, spreading the weight more effectively, reducing the risk of sinking, and ensuring that the peat could be transported safely back to Sauerbrod. If weather conditions were favorable after the harvest, peat transport usually began in late September. In wetter years, however, the bog surface was too soft for carts, and work had to wait for the first seasonal frosts, when the ground hardened. In the uplands, early snowfall was not uncommon, and entire transport plans could be delayed by sudden changes in weather. Under normal conditions, no more than 2 cartloads could be moved per day. Work began at dawn and continued until nightfall. Once the draft animal was harnessed to the cart, helpers brought their loading tools to the drying ground. Most important among these were the baskets, as all peat was loaded by hand from the stacks onto the cart. Each worker had a basket of their own. To increase capacity, the cart body was reinforced with wooden boards at the front and rear. Before the cart arrived, one person usually went ahead to collect peat pieces blown from the stacks by the wind and return them to place. The peat had already passed through many stages of labor, and no one wished to lose even a single block. When the cart reached the edge of the site, the driver first tended to the draft animal, hanging a feed bag and securing the reins so it could rest while loading took place. By the end of the season, the peat in the stacks had dried so thoroughly that when poured from baskets into the cart, it sounded like falling wood. Loaders held the basket close to the stack to scoop from the upper layers, while for lower layers, the basket was set on the ground. The pale fibers clinging to the peat blocks were not part of the fuel itself, but remnants of bog grasses that had adhered during drying. Two main types of baskets were in use. One, known as the res, was oval-shaped and woven from oak splints. The other was a round basket with a funnel-shaped base, woven from rowan shoots, known by a local name and without an equivalent on the German side. Each basket type suited a particular loading technique, depending on the height and position of the peat stack. Once the cart was filled, about 2,500 peat blocks. The load was stacked in layers against the supporting rails so it could be piled high without falling off on the rough tracks. Loading a cart was a skill requiring experience, as the goal was to carry as much as possible in as few trips as possible. Given the poor roads and long distances, a family typically needed 10 to 16 cartloads to bring all their peat home, a task that took at least a full week of work.
Stay.
The right to cut peat was not granted to everyone. Only long-established families in Sauerbrunn held this privilege. Under communal rules, they were also obliged to cut peat for the village priest, the poor, and households whose head was ill. Those without rights, even if they lived in the village, had to purchase peat from entitled families. Beyond household use, peat was once an important commodity. From the late Middle Ages onward, it was used to pay rents to landowners or to monasteries such as Stablo Malmedy. With the rise of the textile industry, peat was transported from the Monschau and Yupin regions to fire-dyeing vats, becoming part of the regional economic network. In this context, loading and transport were not merely the final technical stages of peat cutting, but a vital link between bog labor and the wider economic and social life of the region.
Proberen.
When the peat cart reaches the home, unloading usually takes place in the rear storage shed. The peat is still handled with baskets, using the same method as on the cutting grounds. Blocks are scooped up, emptied, and passed along by hand until the cart is completely cleared. Because large quantities are needed to last through the winter, storage space must be carefully organized. The peat blocks are stacked into a solid wall at the front of the shed, serving both as a partition and as structural support. Behind this wall, peat is tipped loosely to make full use of the available space. This arrangement allows large volumes to be stored, while still making it easy to remove fuel gradually during the cold season. Such storage practices were once common in many villages around the high fens. From around 1925 onward, however, the use of peat as household fuel declined sharply on the German side and survived longer only in a few communities, including Sauerbrod. In daily life, a small peat box was usually kept beside the stove. Dry peat burns with a low, smoldering heat, producing white ash and a sharp, slightly acrid smoke rather than open flames. Its heating value is lower than that of lignite, but sufficient for cooking and warming living spaces. After long working days, peat cutters typically ate simple yet energy-rich meals such as gore, oatmeal fried in lard, once the storehouse is full and the peat blocks lie stacked in the darkness of the shed. The labor cycle that began in early summer and ended in late autumn comes to a close. The Ven year does not end with the final spade cut, but with the certainty that winter has been prepared for, along with the closing of a communal rhythm that shaped the time, labor, and memory of upland families for generations.
Vamos estar fertig, dann ist er disparat.
The entire process of cutting, drying, and transporting peat on the high fens forms a tightly organized cycle of labor, governed by seasonal rhythms and harsh natural conditions. Every stage, from the first spade cut to the stacking of peat in the storehouse, demands precise technique, careful water management, and close cooperation among families, reflecting generations of accumulated knowledge and sauerbraten. Peat is therefore more than a heating fuel. It is the product of a long-standing relationship between people, bog, and community. As peat cutting gradually faded, the Ven year came to an end as a traditional way of life. Yet documenting and reconstructing this process remains essential to preserving collective memory and understanding a resilient form of labor deeply rooted in nature. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If you enjoy videos like this, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories. RaWMachines, signing off, and see you next time.